Before I start, subscribe my channel and like this video. Let's go. The night Issei Hayato turned 16 was not supposed to be special. It was not supposed to be the kind of night that people remember for the rest of their lives. It was not supposed to be the kind of night where the entire direction of a person's future gets carved out like a river cutting through stone, slow at first, then sudden, then irreversible. But fate, as Issei had learned from reading too many manga volumes late into the night, had a very particular sense of humor. And fate, it seemed, had decided that the night of his 16th birthday was the perfect time to upend everything he thought he knew about himself, about the world, and about the strange, terrifying, and somehow beautiful path that was now opening up before him. It started, like most strange things in Issei's life, with a girl. Her name was Yuma Amano. She had long dark hair that moved like silk in the autumn wind and eyes that caught the light in a way that made them look almost too bright, like something artificial, like a lamp turned up too high. She had approached him 3 weeks before his birthday, outside Ko Academy, standing near the school gate with her bag hanging from one shoulder and a small, polite smile on her face. She had asked him if he wanted to go on a date. Just like that. No build-up, no hints, no months of awkward glancing from across the classroom. Just a direct, clean question, offered like something perfectly ordinary. Issei, who had never been asked out by anyone in his life, who had spent most of his middle school years being called a pervert by the girls in his class and a hopeless case by his friends Matsuda and Motohama, had said yes so fast that the word was out of his mouth before his brain had even finished processing the question. The 3 weeks that followed were, by any measure, the best 3 weeks of Issei Hayato's short life. Yuma was kind. She laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. She texted him back quickly. She met him after school and walked with him through the small streets near his house, talking about nothing in particular, and somehow those conversations felt like the most important conversations he had ever had. He told Matsuda and Motohama about her, and they had looked at him like he had grown a second head. Because boys like them did not get girlfriends, not real ones, not ones who showed up and smiled and held his hand while they walked past the convenience store at the end of his street. But Yuma did all of those things, and for 3 weeks, Issei let himself believe that maybe he was the kind of person good things happened to. His birthday fell on a Saturday. The air that evening carried the first real chill of October, and the park near the river where Yuma had asked him to meet was quiet. Most of the families and joggers having gone home when the temperature dropped. The lights along the walking path glowed orange, and the river moved slowly beneath the small bridge at the park's edge, dark and quiet. Issei arrived 5 minutes early. He had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, and had settled on a clean dark jacket over a white shirt, which his mother had nodded at approvingly when he came downstairs. Yuma was already there, standing on the bridge, her back to him, looking at the water. She was wearing a white dress that seemed too light for the season, and her hair was loose. He called her name, and she turned, and for just a moment he thought he saw something flicker across her face, something quick and complicated, like a person setting down a mask they had been holding up for a long time. Then she smiled, and it was the same smile he had been seeing for 3 weeks, and he told himself he had imagined it. They walked for a while. She was quieter than usual, and he filled the silence with talking, which he was not very good at when he was nervous, so he said several things that made no sense, and then laughed at himself, and she smiled again, smaller this time. When they reached the far end of the park, where the path bent away from the river and the lights were fewer and the shadows between the trees were deeper, she stopped. She turned to face him, and she said very calmly that she needed him to die. The words landed without drama, without anger, without any of the emotion that should have been attached to something like that. She said it the way a person might say they needed him to move slightly to the left, just a small request, nothing personal. And then the air around her changed. The white dress shimmered and the warmth she had always carried around her like a kind of atmosphere simply switched off, like a light going out, and what replaced it was something cold and old and deeply unpleasant, the way a room feels after something has died in it, the particular quality of a space that used to hold something living and no longer does. Wings unfolded from her back, black and enormous, catching the orange light from the distant lamps along the path. She rose off the ground a few inches, and her hand came up, palm forward, and a sphere of light gathered in it, white and dense. humming with a pressure that Issei could feel in his chest before she even released it. He did not move in time. The light hit him in the center of his chest, and the pain was not like anything he had ever felt before, not like being hit or burned or cut, but like being fundamentally wrong, like existing in a way that was against the rules, like every part of him was suddenly being told it was not supposed to be there. He fell backward off the path into the grass, and the sky tilted above him, orange and gray, and Yuma landed a few feet away and looked down at him with eyes that had changed color, pink and inhuman, and she told him she was a fallen angel, and that she was sorry, and that he should not take it personally. He lay there in the cold grass, and the pain spread through him like water through fabric, soaking into everything, and he thought several things very quickly. He thought about his parents. He thought about how he had never kissed a girl. He thought about the manga he had left face down on his desk at home, still open to a page he had not finished. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was genuinely it, that this was actually the end, and he was furious about it in a way he had not expected, a hot and immediate fury, not at Yuma or at fallen angels or at whatever the mechanics were behind any of this, but at the sheer wastefulness of it, at the fact that he had barely started, that he had done almost nothing yet with the time he had been given. He reached out his hand, not toward anything, just out, into the air beside him, like a person reaching for something to hold onto in the dark, and something took it. Not a hand, not exactly. More like a pressure, a presence, something vast and complicated that had been waiting somewhere just past the edges of ordinary space and had chosen this moment, this particular moment of ending, to reach back. It flooded into him through that contact, and it was not gentle. It came in like a tide, enormous and purposeful, and it carried with it a sound that was not quite sound, more like a voice that existed below the threshold of hearing, layered and deep, like a chord played on an instrument that did not exist. It said, in a way that bypassed language entirely and landed directly in the center of him, that it had been looking for someone like him for a very long time. The light Yuma had put in him began to push back. She saw it before he understood what was happening. She took a step backward, and her expression shifted, the first genuine emotion he had seen from her all evening, a quick bright flash of fear. He felt the thing inside him reach outward, read the light that was destroying him the same way a person reads a language they have always known, understand it, unpack it, and simply absorb it, take it apart and fold it into itself, and the burning stopped. He sat up. Yuma said something in a language he did not know. She raised her hand again, and more light gathered, brighter this time, more urgent. He felt the presence inside him respond before he consciously chose anything, and his arm came up, and the light hit some surface that was not physical and scattered, harmlessly, into the air around him like a handful of sparks thrown at a wall. She fired again. And again. Each time, he felt the presence read what she was throwing, understand it, match it, neutralize it. He climbed to his feet, and he was aware, in a dim and overwhelmed way, that he was crying, not from pain anymore but from something else he did not have the vocabulary for yet, some combination of terror and grief and something enormous that felt a lot like wonder. Yuma screamed. It was not a human sound. The wings snapped open and she launched herself upward and away into the dark sky, leaving him standing alone in the empty park with the orange lights behind him and the cold river moving quietly and the presence inside him settling, pulling back, folding itself down into something dormant, something patient, something that was now unmistakably, undeniably his. He stood there for a long time. Then he went home, went up to his room, sat on his bed, and stared at the wall. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Matsuda asking if the date had gone well. Issei stared at it for a full minute, then put the phone face down on his desk beside the open manga, and lay back and looked at the ceiling, and said to the presence inside him, out loud, very quietly, "What are you?" Nothing answered. Not in words. But there was a quality to the silence that followed, a kind of attentiveness, that told him clearly enough that it was listening. He fell asleep eventually, still in his jacket, and dreamed of nothing at all. The next 3 days were strange in a way that was difficult to describe to anyone, partly because there was no one he could have described it to without sounding completely unhinged, and partly because he was still working out what had actually happened himself. He went to school. He sat through his classes. He ate lunch with Matsuda and Motohama on the roof, and they asked how the date had gone, and he told them it had not really worked out, which was technically true, if dramatically understating the situation. They expressed condolences in the way boys that age express condolences, which was mostly by calling him unfortunate, and then immediately pivoting to complaints about their own romantic circumstances. He ate his lunch and looked out at the school grounds below and tried to think clearly. Something had come into him. Something enormous and old and complicated. He could feel it the way you feel a room you are standing in even when you are not touching the walls, a constant peripheral awareness, a sense of presence and scale. It was not hostile. It did not feel threatening from the inside. But it was not small, and it was not simple, and every time he turned his attention toward it he got the sense of depth the way you get the sense of depth looking down into dark water. The understanding that what you can see is nowhere near all of what is there. He had tested it, carefully, alone in his room with the door locked on the second night. He had held his hand out and thought at the presence, deliberately and clearly, the way you might try to move a muscle you are not sure you can control, and something happened. A faint shimmer, barely visible, had appeared across his palm. He had pushed more deliberately, and the shimmer had strengthened, taken on texture, become something with weight and resistance. He had gotten scared at that point and pulled back, and it had folded away obediently, leaving his hand looking completely ordinary. He had sat on his bed for a long time after that, thinking. On the third day, he was walking home alone, because Matsuda and Motohama had stayed late for a club meeting, and he was taking the long way because the afternoon was clear and cold and he was not ready to go home and sit in his room with his thoughts yet. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his head slightly down, watching the pavement, when he heard footsteps behind him that matched his pace too exactly. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. He turned around. Standing at the corner of the street, leaning against the wall with her arms folded and the kind of patience that suggested she had been watching him for longer than this particular stretch of road, was a woman who was not easy to look at directly. Not because she was frightening, though she was, a little, in the way that things which are very powerful are frightening, not aggressively but inherently. Not because she was unkind, because her expression was actually something close to neutral, studying him with a focused, professional attention that was not unfriendly. She was simply, extremely, arrestingly beautiful in a way that he was 16 and therefore completely unprepared for. She was tall, with long dark hair tied back loosely, and she was wearing a costume that he recognized immediately because he had grown up in a world where hero costumes were as normal as police uniforms. A hero's outfit, professional and fitted, with a mask pushed up onto her forehead. The costume was distinctive. He knew who she was. Everyone knew who she was. Midnight. The R-rated hero. Number 18 on the national hero rankings. He had seen her on television dozens of times, usually on the late-night news segments about high-profile villain captures, and she was always the same, composed and direct and somehow both entirely in control and completely relaxed about it. She gave interviews with the easy authority of someone who had been doing something difficult for long enough that it stopped being difficult. Just work. Just what you did. He was suddenly and intensely aware, standing 10 feet away from him on a residential street, and looking at him with an expression that suggested she had come here specifically to find him. He said, very intelligently, hi. She said, less casually, that she needed him to come with her. He said, with what he felt was reasonable caution given his experiences 3 days ago, that he would prefer to know why before going anywhere with anyone. Something shifted in her expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. She told him that was a fair answer. Then she told him that she was a licensed hero and that she had been asked by people who tracked unusual quirk activity to check on a very specific kind of reading that had appeared in this area 3 days ago. The kind of reading that only appeared when something significant happened to someone's quirk, or when something that was not quite a quirk attached itself to someone who had previously been quirkless. He went very still. She looked at him steadily and said that the reading had led her here, and that she needed him to come with her, because what she was seeing in the registered quirk data for this area was something that happened very rarely and that needed to be handled carefully, by people who understood what it meant. He thought about the park. He thought about Yuma's face. He thought about the presence inside him, settled and patient, waiting. He thought about the shimmer on his palm and the lamplight of his room. He asked her if she was going to tell him what it meant. She said she would explain everything, but not on a public street. She said she had a car 2 blocks away. He considered this for a long moment. Then he said he was going to text his mother that he would be home late, and she could not stop him from doing that, and she nodded immediately and said, "Of course, go ahead." He texted his mother. Then he looked at Midnight, this famous, composed, professionally dangerous woman who had come looking specifically for him, and he said, "All right, lead the way." The car was a dark blue sedan with agency plates, and she drove efficiently and without drama, keeping her eyes on the road and giving him space to settle, which he appreciated more than he said. She did not fill the silence with reassurances, which he also appreciated, because reassurances from someone who had tracked you to a residential street to tell you that your quirk data was unusual would have felt hollow. She let the silence be what it was. She took him not to a hero agency office, which he had half expected, but to an apartment building near the edge of the Code District. It was newer than the buildings around it, clean and somewhat anonymous, the kind of building that had good security and neighbors who did not ask questions. She parked in the underground lot and led him to an elevator, and they rode up in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was very full, like a room with a lot of furniture in it. The apartment was on the 7th floor. She unlocked it and pushed the door open and gestured for him to go in first, which he did, stepping into a living room that was professional in a way that was slightly at odds with the warmth underneath it. There were case files on the coffee table and a whiteboard against one wall with maps and notes on it, but there were also plants on the windowsill, real ones, well cared for, and a mug on the kitchen counter with a faded logo on it, and a jacket thrown over the back of the couch that was clearly not a work jacket, just an ordinary jacket, the kind you wore when you were being a person rather than a hero. There was someone else in the room. She was sitting on the arm of the couch with one knee up, eating from a container of rice with a pair of chopsticks, and she looked up when they came in with the calm attention of someone who had been expecting them. She was also, issei noticed with the part of his brain that had not yet caught up with the seriousness of the situation, startlingly tall and startlingly beautiful in a completely different way from Midnight, broader and brighter, with blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail and eyes that were direct and curious, and assessing him in the way athletes assess each other, looking for what he was made of. He knew her too. Empty lady. Yu Takayama. Number 23 on the National Hero Rankings, known for a gigantification quirk and a media presence that was arguably larger than her hero ranking suggested, because she was very good at being memorable. He had seen her on television too, usually the morning news, usually being interviewed about whatever she had most recently punched into rubble. She looked at him for a moment with those direct eyes, then looked at Midnight, and said, "So this is the kid?" Midnight said yes, while setting her hero mask on the entry table and pulling a chair around to face the couch. She gestured for Issei to sit. He sat on the couch, not near Empty Lady but not at the far end either, because sitting at the far end would have looked like he was afraid. And he was already working hard not to look like he was afraid, which he was, a little, though less than he had been 3 days ago in the park, because at least this fear had professional heroes in it. Midnight sat in the chair, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, and looked at him seriously and said, "I am going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond, because the parts of it that sound unbelievable are going to make more sense by the end." He said, "All right." She said, "There is a type of power that is very old. It predates the era of quirks. It predates much of what we currently understand about how abilities work and why certain people have them. It is a power that is defined by its relationship to other powers, specifically its ability to take them, hold them, store them, and give them to others. It has appeared throughout recorded history in fragments and traces, usually in contexts that historians dismissed as mythology or exaggeration. The hero community has known about it, theoretically, for decades because the man who most recently held it was a villain who used it in ways that caused enormous harm." She paused. He said very carefully, "Was?" She nodded. She said that the most recent holder of this power had died some years ago. She said that this kind of power, when it loses a host, does not simply disappear. It searches. It is, in a limited sense, semi-sentient, in that it has criteria and it selects according to them, and it waits, sometimes for years, until the right conditions and the right person appear. She said that 3 days ago, The monitoring equipment that the hero community maintains to detect unusual quirk signatures had registered a very specific type of event in the code district. The signature was unmistakable to the people who knew what to look for. It was the signature of All for One choosing a new host. He sat very quietly for a moment. Then he said, "That is the name of it." All for One. She said, "Yes," he said. "And it chose me?" She said, "Yes." He sat with that for another moment. Outside the window the city lights were coming on as the evening settled in, small and steady, the ordinary infrastructure of a normal city having a normal evening. He thought about the park. He thought about the thing that had taken his outstretched hand in the dark, vast and purposeful and waiting. He thought about the shimmer on his palm in his room, tentative and real. He said, "The man who had it before was a villain?" She said, "Yes." She said he was one of the most dangerous people who had ever existed, and that the quirk had been used to build a criminal organization of enormous scale, and had caused decades of harm and suffering. He said, "And now it is in me?" She said, "Yes." And then she said something that surprised him. She said that was not, in itself, a problem. She said the power had no inherent morality. It was a tool, and like all tools its nature was determined entirely by the person holding it. She said that the hero community did not consider him a threat. She said they considered him a person who had something very significant happen to him without any choice in the matter, and who was now going to need support and guidance, and, she said this part in a tone that was carefully chosen to be matter-of-fact, very serious and very careful training, because what he was carrying was not a quirk that could be left alone to develop on its own timeline. Empty Lady, who had been quiet through all of this, set her container of rice down on the coffee table and said straightforwardly, "How are you doing with all of this right now?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the same direct attention she had used when he walked in, but warmer now, more personal, less assessing. He said honestly that he was not sure. He said that 3 days ago a girl he had been dating for 3 weeks told him she was a fallen angel and tried to kill him. And then something enormous attached itself to him from somewhere he could not locate or describe, and he had been spending the last 3 days trying to decide if he had imagined the whole thing or gone quietly insane, and so having 2 professional heroes tell him it was real was both a relief and its own kind of overwhelming. Empty Lady looked at Midnight. Midnight looked at Issei, and said, "The fallen angel?" He said, "Yes." She said, "We need to talk about that separately." She said the fallen angel situation was connected to something larger, a world that existed alongside the ordinary one, a world of devils and angels and fallen angels and creatures of various types, and that specifically was a territory with unusual significance in that context. She said they had been aware of increased activity in the area and that an attack on a civilian was significant and required following up. He said, "So there are actual fallen angels and actual devils?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And that is a whole separate thing on top of the quirk thing?" She said, "Yes, more or less." He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, the kind of sound a person makes when they encounter the outer limit of their capacity to be surprised. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, and breathed slowly. Then he lowered his hands and looked at both of them and said, "All right. What happens now?" What happened now, it turned out, was that Midnight and Empty Lady were assigned as his official handlers by the hero community. This was explained to him over the next hour, with tea that Empty Lady made in the kitchen and brought out on a tray with the easy practicality of someone who had decided that the situation called for tea and was not going to ask anyone's opinion on the matter. The assignment was, Midnight explained, unofficial in the sense that it did not appear in any public records, but very official in the sense that it had been authorized by people at very high levels of the hero establishment, people who had taken the news of All for One's reappearance with extreme seriousness, and wanted to ensure that the situation was managed with care and discretion. She and Empty Lady had been chosen because they were both high-ranking, both experienced, both based in the area, and both, she said this simply and without particular emphasis, considered reliable in situations requiring significant judgment calls. He asked what managing the situation with care and discretion meant practically. Midnight said it meant several things. It meant regular training sessions to help him understand and control what he was carrying, because All for One was not a passive power. It was active and responsive, and it would grow and change as he interacted with the world, and that needed to be structured and monitored carefully. It meant they would be his primary point of contact for anything relating to the supernatural dimension of his situation, meaning the devils and fallen angels and whatever else might take an interest in him. It meant they would need to be in close and regular contact, which was logistically simplified by the fact that this apartment had a second bedroom currently being used for storage that could be cleared out. He stopped. He said, "You want me to live here?" Midnight said it was not a demand. She said it was a strong recommendation based on practical considerations, specifically that a 16-year-old boy carrying one of the most powerful abilities in recorded history, and who had already been targeted by a fallen angel once, was safer with professional heroes nearby than in a family home with no awareness of the situation. He thought about his parents. He thought about explaining any part of this to them. He said, "I would need to talk to my parents." She said, "Of course." She said she would speak with them herself if he wanted, in her professional capacity, and frame it in terms of a quirk development program, which was not entirely untrue. Empty lady, sitting across from him with her tea, said, "You will have your own room, and we are not going to be weird about it, if that is what you are thinking. We are professionals. This is a professional situation." He said he was not thinking that. She gave him a look that said she was not entirely sure she believed him, but that she was going to accept the answer. He looked at both of them, these two women who were suddenly, without any input from him, a very significant part of his life, and he thought about the park in the dark and the hand that had reached back when he reached out, and he thought that whatever came next, he did not want to face it alone. That had been the thing he had felt most clearly in those 3 days of sitting in his room turning it over in his mind. Not fear, not excitement, not even the enormity of what he was carrying. Just the very clear and specific sensation of being alone with something too large for one person. He said, "All right." He said he would talk to his parents, and he would think about the room, and he would come back. Midnight nodded. She said that was reasonable. He stood up to leave, and he paused at the door and turned back, because there was one more thing he needed to ask, and he was not sure how to frame it, so he just said it directly. He said, "You came looking for me because of what I am carrying?" He said, "Is that the only reason you are doing this?" Midnight held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "No." She said he was a 16-year-old boy who had been targeted by a supernatural entity, and had survived because of something he did not choose and does not fully understand yet. She said that was, independent of everything else, a person who needed help, and that helping people was what she did. Empty lady did not say anything, but she looked at him in a way that agreed with everything Midnight had just said. He said, "Thank you." And then he went out the door and down the elevator and out into the city evening, and the presence inside him stirred faintly as he walked, like something turning over in its sleep, and he put his hand in his pocket and breathed the cold October air, and thought that everything was about to change, and that he was, despite himself, despite the fear and the strangeness and the enormous weight of it, not entirely unhappy about that. He talked to his parents that evening. It went better than he had expected, partly because his mother was the kind of person who processed alarming information by asking very practical questions, and partly because his father, who worked in construction and had a deep respect for licensed heroes and for the structures of official authority, responded to the words hero community program and supervised training with the kind of immediate deference that issei had always found both reassuring and slightly funny. They were worried. His mother held his hands and looked at his face carefully, checking him the way she had checked him for fever when he was small. His father asked several questions about the legitimacy of the arrangement and the credentials of the people involved. Issei answered everything as honestly as he could, which meant being honest about some things and very carefully vague about others, because the full story was not something anyone could have absorbed in one evening. By 9 o'clock, his parents had agreed that he could try it, with the conditions that he came home for dinner at least twice a week, that his grades did not drop, and that he called his mother every single day, no exceptions. He agreed to all of this without hesitation. That night he lay in his own bed in his own room for what he suspected was one of the last nights of his old life, and he looked at the ceiling in the dark, and he spoke to the thing inside him again, quietly, the way you might speak to someone in the next room through a closed door. He said, "I do not know what you are, exactly." He said he knew the name they gave it and some of the history, and that the history was not good. He said he was not the person who had held it before, and he was not going to use it the way that person had used it. He said he was 16 and he had almost nothing to offer, no power, no training, no experience, nothing except the fact that he was here and it had chosen him, and he intended, whatever else happened, to be worth choosing. The presence inside him was quiet. But it was an attentive quiet, the kind that meant it was listening. He closed his eyes. Outside, October had settled fully over the city, and the street below was empty and still, and the lights of Ko glowed faintly against the low clouds. And somewhere across the city in a 7th-floor apartment, Midnight was reviewing a case file and Empty Lady was asleep on the couch with the television on low, and none of them knew yet what was coming. The battles and the training and the strange warmth that would grow slowly between them, the way things grow when people keep showing up for each other, steady and quiet and real. None of them knew yet how much they were going to come to mean to each other, or how long and difficult and occasionally wonderful the road ahead was. But it was there, waiting, the same way the presence inside issei was waiting, patient, certain, already beginning. The second bedroom in Midnight's apartment had been used, until 3 days before issei moved in, as a combination storage room and overflow wardrobe. He knew this because when Empty Lady slid the door open to show him the space on the morning he arrived with his bags, the first thing he saw was a mountain of boxes stacked against the far wall, 3 garment bags hanging from a temporary clothing rail, and a rolled-up yoga mat leaning in the corner like it had given up on being used. Empty Lady looked at the room. Then she looked at him. Then she said, "We started clearing it last night." He looked at the cleared half of the room, which contained a bed frame that had been assembled recently enough that the instruction sheet was still on the mattress, and said, "I can see that." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, picked up the nearest box, and carried it out into the hallway with the ease of someone who could, when needed, be several stories tall and could lift buses. She said over her shoulder that the rest of the boxes would be in the hallway by the time he had brought his bags up from the car, and that he should not look in any of them because most of the contents were Midnight's and Midnight was particular about her things. He said he would not look in any of them. He brought his bags up from the car, which was his father's, his father having insisted on driving him over personally and carrying the heaviest bag up the stairs himself with the solemn efficiency of a man performing a duty, and standing in the apartment hallway afterward looking around at the clean, professionally furnished space with an expression that said he was satisfied with what he was seeing, that this was a legitimate place with legitimate people, and that his son was going to be all right here. His father shook hands with Midnight, who had come out to meet them in a blazer and dark trousers rather than her hero costume, and who was, issei thought, very good at being professionally reassuring when she wanted to be. His father asked about the training schedule, and she described it in terms that were accurate but accessible, using language calibrated for a parent who needed to leave feeling informed rather than overwhelmed. His father nodded at regular intervals. When Midnight finished, he turned to issei, gripped his shoulder once, firm and brief, and said, "Call your mother tonight." Issei said he would. His father left. The door closed. The apartment was quiet for a moment. Then Empty Lady appeared from the hallway carrying another box and said, "Your dad is intense." Issei said, "He is not intense, he is just thorough." She disappeared back into the hallway and said through the wall, "Those are the same thing." He stood in the living room with his bags around him and looked at the space properly for the first time, the way you look at a place when you know you are going to be living in it rather than visiting. It was larger than it had seemed on his first visit. Or maybe it just seemed larger now that the purpose of his being there had become concrete. The living room connected to a kitchen on the left, and a short hallway on the right that led to 3 doors, his room at the end, Midnight's room on the right, and a shared bathroom on the left. The windows faced south and the morning light came in well and the plants on the sill were still thriving, which meant someone was taking care of them consistently, which for some reason he found quietly reassuring. Midnight came in from the kitchen with a mug in each hand and set one on the coffee table in front of him. She said, "Settle in first. Training does not start until tomorrow. Today you can find your feet." He picked up the mug. It was tea, the same kind Empty Lady had made on his first visit. He said, "Thank you." She sat in the chair she had sat in before, with her own mug, and looked at him in the direct, assessing way that he was already starting to recognize as simply how she looked at things, not unfriendly, just thorough, like his father, though he was not going to say that out loud. She said, "Rules?" He said, all right. She said, the kitchen is shared and whoever cooks does not clean, whoever cleans does not cook. She said he was welcome to use anything in the refrigerator that was not labeled, and that the labeled things were used and you was not rational about her labeled things, so he should simply treat them as someone else's property, and not touch them. She said the bathroom schedule was fluid and they were all adults about it, which meant he was an adult about it. She said the whiteboard in the living room was a work board and he was welcome to look at it, but not to move or erase anything without asking. She said guests were fine with notice. She said noise after 11 on weeknights was not fine, and noise after midnight on weekends was also not fine, because they both had early starts most mornings. He said, those are very reasonable rules. She said, we will find out. He took his bags down the hall to his room, which was now fully cleared, empty lady having apparently moved the last of the boxes while he was talking to Midnight, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the assembled bed and the clean walls and the window that looked out over the street below, and the buildings beyond, the city going about its ordinary business in the mid-morning light. He thought, not for the first time in the past 4 days, how completely strange this was. Then he put his bags down and started unpacking. He unpacked with more care than he usually gave to things, because the room was clean and new and not yet his, and there is a particular attention you give to spaces that are not yet yours, a self-consciousness about taking up room. He put his clothes in the wardrobe that had been cleared for him. He put his books on the small shelf above the desk. He put his manga in a stack on the floor beside the desk, because the shelf was not quite big enough, and he was not going to ask for more shelf space on his first day. He set his phone charger on the desk and his alarm on his phone and his school bag by the door, and then he sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at what he had done, which was not much, and thought that it looked nothing like his room at home, which was fine. It was not supposed to. It was a different room and a different life. He reached inward, the way he had been doing since the park, checking on the presents the way you check on something you are not sure about, a window you might have left open, a candle you are not sure you put out. It was there, the same as it always was, settled and patient, resting in some part of him that he did not have the anatomical vocabulary to name accurately. He had started thinking of it as simply the power, because all for one was a name with history attached to it, history that was not his, and he needed something to call it that was neutral, something that did not carry all of that weight every time he thought it. The power was quiet. It often was, during ordinary moments. It seemed to respond primarily to things that mattered, to high emotion, to physical threat, to the specific quality of focused attention. When he spoke to it directly, it listened. When he ignored it, it waited. It did not intrude. It did not push. It was simply there, the way a very large and very still thing is simply there. He said to it, quietly, in the way he had started doing, "This is where we live now." Nothing but the attentive quality of the silence. He went back out to the living room. Lunch was leftover rice and vegetables that empty lady heated up on the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been feeding themselves for long enough that cooking had become pure function rather than any kind of event. She put a bowl in front of him at the kitchen counter without asking if he wanted it, because it was noon and he was there, and that was apparently sufficient justification. Midnight was on a call at the kitchen table, speaking quietly into her phone with her back to the room, her posture the particular kind of upright that meant the conversation was professional. Issei ate his rice and looked out the kitchen window. Empty lady sat across from him with her own bowl and said, "So? School?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Co-academy?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That is the one with the two famous devil airs, the Gremery girl and the Citry girl." She said it with the same tone she might use to mention that a neighborhood had a good ramen place, as a relevant piece of local information. He said, "The girls with the scary aura who everyone at school is vaguely afraid of." She said, "Yes, those ones." She said that Ko was Gremery territory and had been for some time, and that the devil's situation in the area was complicated and stratified and he should know about it in general terms, and Midnight would go through it in more detail with him during training. She said for now the important thing was that he knew it was there, and that he should tell them immediately if anything unusual happened at school, anything he could not explain in ordinary terms. He said, "Like the girl I was dating being a fallen angel." She said, "Yes, exactly like that, and preferably earlier in the relationship, ideally before the attempted murder." He said, "That is very useful advice after the fact." she said. Think of it as prophylactic advice for the next time. He looked at her. She was eating her rice with complete composure, as though she had said something entirely normal. He thought that she was genuinely funny, in a way that was dry and quick and slightly unexpected from someone who had the kind of physical presence and on-camera persona she had. On television she was bold and brash and performative in a way that was entertaining but not particularly deep. In person she was quicker and sharper and considerably more comfortable to be around than he would have predicted. Midnight finished her call and came to the counter and took the remaining portion of rice out of the pan with the authority of someone in their own kitchen, which she was. She said, I heard the last part, she said, regarding Co-Academy. He should also know that Rias Gremery is aware of him, or will be shortly. She said that when a power like the one he was carrying activated in a devil's territory, the devil noticed. She said they needed to decide how to handle that introduction, because it was going to happen whether they planned for it or not. He put his chopsticks down and looked at her and said, How many separate enormous things am I dealing with right now? She counted briefly on her fingers. She said, the power, the fallen angel situation and whatever sent her, the devil territorial question, and the general training and development arc of someone carrying an ability of this significance. He said, 4? She said, yes. He picked his chopsticks back up and said, fine. One thing at a time. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, something between approval and something warmer that she kept professional by keeping it brief. She said, yes. Exactly like that. That afternoon, while Midnight was out on a scheduled patrol shift, Empty Lady sat with him in the living room and did something he had not expected, which was that she did not talk about the power or the training or the supernatural situation at all. She asked him about school. She asked him which subjects he was good at, which turned out to be history and physical education, and which ones he struggled with, which turned out to be mathematics and, occasionally, paying attention. She asked about his friends, and he told her about Matsuda and Motohama, describing them with the affectionate exasperation of someone who had known people long enough to love their flaws, and she laughed at the description of their rooftop lunch conversations and their elaborate and completely unsuccessful attempts to spy on the girls' kendo club through the fence. He said, they are not bad people, they are just very focused on a very narrow area of interest. She said, at 16 that is fairly standard for boys. He said, I was the same, to be honest. She said, and now? He thought about it. He said, now I am slightly more concerned with not getting killed by supernatural entities, which has adjusted my priorities somewhat. She said that was probably healthy. He asked her, because he was curious and because she had not volunteered it, and he wanted to understand the shape of the situation, how she had ended up on this assignment. He said, not questioning it, just trying to understand. She leaned back in the couch and considered the question with the directness she seemed to apply to most things. She said that when Midnight had been contacted about the all-for-one reading and asked if she could take point on the situation, Midnight had immediately asked her to come in alongside, because they had worked together before and because the situation had enough variables that two people made more sense than one. She said she had said yes because Midnight had asked and she respected Midnight's judgment, and because the situation itself was the kind of thing you said yes to. He asked what kind of thing that was. She said the kind where someone young ends up holding something enormous through no choice of their own, and the question is whether the people around them make it worse or better. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and you intend to make it better? She said, that is the plan. He looked at his hands, resting in his lap, completely ordinary looking, and thought about the shimmer, the thing he had called up in his room, tentative and real. He said, I do not actually know what I can do yet. With the power. I have only touched it once, and only barely. She said, that changes tomorrow? He said, are you going to be there for the training sessions? She said, yes. She said, Midnight leads the sessions, she is more qualified for that specific thing, but I am there. She said that was part of the arrangement. He nodded. He said, good. She looked at him with those direct eyes and said, why good specifically? He said honestly, because the whole thing is less frightening when there are two of you. He said he was aware that was not the most impressive thing to admit. She said, it is not unimpressive. She said people who know what they need are easier to work with than people who pretend they do not need anything. He said, that sounds like something from a textbook. She said, it sounds like that because it is true, and true things tend to get written down a lot. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed properly since the park, and it surprised him a little, the ease of it, the way it came out without effort. She smiled, and it was a different smile from the one she used in interviews, less performed, more immediate, and it made her face look younger and more open. And he thought that he was going to be all right here. He thought that in a real way, not as a thing he told himself to feel better, but as an actual read on the situation. That evening Midnight came back from patrol at 7, a little tired around the eyes, and changed out of her hero costume in her room while Issei, who had claimed the kitchen in accordance with the rule that whoever cooked did not clean, made dinner. He had texted his mother in the afternoon to ask what he could realistically make without instructions, and she had sent back a recipe for a simple miso soup and rice with grilled fish that was within his abilities. He had found the ingredients in the kitchen, because both Midnight and Empty Lady appeared to maintain a well-stocked larder, and he had spent 40 minutes making it with more care than was probably necessary, because cooking for people you do not know well is a particular kind of performance, and he wanted to do it correctly. Empty Lady appeared from the living room at the smell, leaned in the kitchen doorway, and said, "You can actually cook," he said somewhat. She said, "Midnight cannot cook at all and I cook functionally but without enthusiasm, so this is already an improvement on the current situation." Midnight appeared behind her and said, "I can hear you." Empty Lady said, "I said it loudly on purpose." They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, which was the first time they had done that together, and it was slightly awkward in the way that eating with people you do not know well is always slightly awkward, everyone negotiating the question of how much space to take up, how much to talk, what topics are available. But the food was good and warm and the miso soup was, Issei thought, close enough to his mother's that it helped with the small persistent ache of being somewhere new, and Midnight ate with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely hungry, and Empty Lady had 2 portions, which he chose to take as a compliment. After dinner, while Empty Lady did the washing up with the resigned efficiency of someone honoring an agreement they had made, Midnight spread a map on the coffee table and called Issei over. The map was of detailed and marked, and she pointed to several locations and gave him a brief introduction to what she called the practical geography of the situation, meaning the areas with known supernatural significance, the territories, the relevant buildings, the spots she needed him to avoid for now until they had better information about his situation. She was efficient and clear and she did not over-explain, which he appreciated. She gave him exactly what he needed and trusted him to hold it. He asked questions. She answered them. By the end of it he had a clearer picture, not complete, but functional, a working map of the world he was now operating in. She rolled the map back up and said, "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. She said they would go to the training facility. She said she wanted to see what the power did when he deliberately engaged it, because she had read everything available on All for One, and she needed to calibrate based on what was actually in front of her rather than historical data." He said, "All right." She said, "Get a good night's sleep." He said he would try. He went to his room and lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow with a mixture of anticipation and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the feeling before something large, the hell breathe before the plunge. He reached inward. The power was there. Patient and still, he said to it, quietly, "We start tomorrow." The attentive quiet. The listening. He closed his eyes, and outside in the living room he could hear the low sound of the television. And down the hall Montana Lady was saying something and Midnight was responding in the tone she used when she was not quite agreeing but not disagreeing either, and the apartment settled around all of them, new and tentative and already, in the small ways that matter, beginning to be home. The training facility was not what he had expected. He had expected something governmental and concrete, a gray room with equipment bolted to the walls and people in lab coats taking readings. What he got was a private facility operated by a small hero support organization that Midnight described as affiliated with the broader hero community, but independent enough to handle sensitive cases without the bureaucratic overhead of the main agencies. It was a single-story building on the edge of an industrial district, unremarkable from the outside, but inside it opened into a large training space with a high ceiling and reinforced walls and a floor marked with impact zones, and a smaller observation room off to one side with recording equipment, and a monitoring station. A man named Tsubasa was running the monitoring station. He was older, with the particular manner of a technician who had spent decades working with abilities he himself did not have. Respectful of the power without being impressed by it, focused entirely on the data. He introduced himself to Issei with a brief, firm handshake and said he would be capturing readings throughout the session, and that nothing he recorded left the facility without Midnight's explicit authorization. Issei said, "Thank you." Tsubasa said, "Do not thank me, just try to give me something useful to work with," and went back to his monitors. Midnight walked Issei to the center of the training space and stood opposite him and said, "I want you to do what you did in your room." She said, "The shimmer on your hand?" "Exactly that." "Nothing more, just that." He said, "All right." He stood still for a moment, orienting himself, finding the particular quality of internal attention that he had used in his room. The power was not something he could point to specifically, it was more distributed than that, present throughout him in the way temperature is present in a body, and engaging it was less like pressing a button and more like changing the quality of his attention, turning towards something that was always there, letting it surface. The shimmer appeared on his palm. Faint, iridescent, hovering a few millimeters above the skin. Midnight said, "Good. Hold it steady." He held it. It was easier than it had been in his room, he noticed. More responsive, less tentative, as though doing it twice made it more available, as though the path between him and the power was a path you wore into the ground by walking it, clearer with each use. Midnight walked around him slowly, looking at the shimmer from different angles. She said, "Push more of it out." He pushed. The shimmer expanded, spreading from his palm to his fingers, up toward his wrist. It thickened, became more substantial, the air around it developing a faint charge. She said, "Stop there." She said, "What does it feel like?" He thought about how to answer that. He said it felt like holding a very large breath, like the sensation of containing something that wanted to expand further but was being held deliberately. He said it was not uncomfortable, it was more like exertion, like the feeling of holding a muscle tense. She said, "Does the power communicate with you? Does it give you information?" He said, "Yes, in a way." He said it was not language, it was more direct than that. He said when the fallen angel had attacked him, the power had seemed to understand what she was doing and respond to it automatically, before he consciously chose anything. Midnight said, "That is consistent with the historical accounts." She said the original holder described it as the power having a kind of instinct, a reflexive intelligence that operated below deliberate choice. She said that was useful in emergency situations and potentially dangerous and ambiguous ones. He said, "Because it might respond to things I have not chosen to respond to." She said, "Exactly." She said that was one of the things they needed to map out and develop controls for. She said a power that acts on instinct without deliberate engagement was a liability in situations requiring judgment. He nodded. He let the shimmer fade and shook his hand out, a reflex. Empty lady, who had been watching from the edge of the room with her arms folded, said, "Try calling it up faster this time." She said, "Not the shimmer specifically, just the power. Call it up fast and see what happens." He looked at Midnight, who nodded. He did not think about it, he just reached for it, quickly, the way you reach for something without looking, and the power came up immediately, faster than he had expected, and the air in the room changed, and the monitoring equipment in the observation room made several sounds that were not alarmed but were very interested, and both Midnight and Empty Lady went slightly more still, the way people with combat experience go still when something they were not certain about turns out to be larger than estimated. The shimmer was everywhere. Both hands up his arms, a faint presence across his chest. He could feel it wanting to go further, and he was holding it, not with effort exactly but with intention, like holding a door against a steady pressure. He said, "Is this?" Midnight said, "Yes." She said, "Bring it down slowly." He brought it down. It took about 4 seconds, longer than raising it had. He stood there in the aftermath, breathing a little faster than usual, and the room was quiet except for the sounds of Tsubasa's equipment processing what it had just recorded. Empty Lady exhaled. She said, "Okay." Midnight said, "Okay." He said, "Was that bad?" Midnight said, "No." She said, "It is significant." She said that based on what she was seeing and what Tsubasa's equipment was recording, what he was carrying was not degraded or partial. She said it appeared to be the full complex of abilities that all for one represented, which meant the training timeline she had been working from needed to be revised, because what she had expected to have months to develop was clearly already substantially present. He said, "Is that good or bad?" She said, "It is neither." She said it was information. He said, all right. Empty lady came off the wall and walked toward him. She said, how are you feeling right now? Physically, he said, a little warm. A little like after you sprint. Not bad. She looked at him closely and said, no headache, no dizziness. He said no. She said good. She said that in her experience with high-output quirks, the physical feedback loop was important data, that the body's response to power use was a reliable indicator of sustainable limits. She said they were going to track that carefully. He said, you know a lot about training high-output quirks. She said, I spent 3 years working with a support trainer who specialized in physical transformation quirks, which have some overlap with what they are dealing with here in terms of whole-body engagement. She said she was not an expert in his specific situation, but she was not coming in blind either. He said, that is reassuring. She said, I know. He smiled. She caught it, and something in her expression adjusted, a small thing, barely visible, but it was there. Midnight said 2 more exercises, then we stop for today. They did 2 more exercises. The first was a controlled release, pushing the power outward in a single direction and stopping it at a specific distance, a matter of precision rather than volume. He was better at this than he expected, the power responding to spatial intention with surprising accuracy, though the far edge of the controlled area was less clean than the near edge, which Midnight said was expected and would improve with practice. The second was a recovery test, raising the power to a high output, and then releasing it completely, and measuring how long it took him to feel baseline again. The answer was about 90 seconds, which Midnight said was relatively fast for the magnitude of output he had demonstrated. By the end of the session he was genuinely tired, not exhausted, but the particular tiredness of sustained concentration, the kind that settles in the chest and behind the eyes. They drove back to the apartment in Midnight's car with him in the back seat and the 2 of them in the front, and no one talked very much, and he watched the city pass outside the window and thought that it was real, all of it, the power and the training and the 2 of them, and that being real made it manageable in a way that the abstract version of it had not been. That evening he called his mother. She asked how the first full day had been. He said it had been good. She asked about the room, the food, the people. He said the room was fine. The food was good because he had cooked it himself, and the people were professional and kind. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a parent digesting information they have decided to trust, and then she said she was glad, and that she would make his favorite for dinner on Wednesday when he came home. He said he would be there. After he hung up he sat on his bed and the apartment was quiet around him, and he could hear Midnight's voice from somewhere down the hall, talking quietly on the phone again, the rhythm of it measured and professional. He could hear Empty Lady in the kitchen, the specific sounds of someone making tea without particular interest in the process, just the functional sequence of it. He lay back and looked at the ceiling and let himself be still for the first time all day. The power was quiet inside him, the good kind of quiet, satisfied and present, like something that had been exercised and was now resting. He thought about what Midnight had said, that it appeared to be the full complex of abilities, not degraded, not partial. He did not know exactly what that meant yet, what the full scope of it was, what it could do beyond what he had already touched. There was a lot he did not know. There was going to be a lot to learn, but today had been the first day of learning it, and he had not failed, and both of them had looked at what he was carrying and not been frightened of him. And he was in a clean room in a good apartment with people who were going to help him figure this out, and his mother was making his favorite for Wednesday, and all of that together felt, in the most ordinary and real way, like enough. He closed his eyes. Outside, the October city moved through its evening, and the world that most people knew and the world underneath it both continued their parallel existence, and somewhere in Co-Academy, a certain red-haired devil felt a faint shift in the energy of her territory and frowned at nothing in particular, and made a mental note to investigate, and knew nothing yet about the boy who was the source of it. But she would.